I'm Kendall Klaus. I'm chair of the Committee on the Environment, and I'm joined by Ashley Griswold, who's my co-chair, and Miguel Walker, who is our outgoing chair. And we have a really special event for you all. So excited that you could join us. But first, we have to thank our sponsors, as usual, Indoor Weather Professionals, Pilgrim, and Hill and Wilkinson. We can't do it without them, and they've really helped us and the AIA in general through this past year, and we appreciate them. Today we are hosting our last and final part in our AIAU series on resiliency and adaptation. And we are joined by some really special guests that we're excited to introduce you to. First, we are going to show some videos of that were provided by AIAU, and it'll give an introduction to the terms resiliency and adaptation and what it means for our industry. And then I will hand it off to Miguel, who will host a panel discussion with our special guests. So this may or may not be loud when I press play, so just be ready to adjust your volume as needed. And let me know if there are any questions. You can put them in the Q&A, and Ashley will be monitoring that throughout the presentation.
Introduction and overview brought to you by AIA. Welcome to the AIA online series, Resilience and Adaptation. You are taking Course 1, Introduction and Overview, brought to you by AIAU. The AIA online series, Resilience and Adaptation, is a comprehensive multi-part curriculum developed by the AIA and delivered through AIAU. Welcome to Course 1, Introduction and Overview. This course introduces and provides the historical context for the subjects of resilience and adaptation in the built environment and provides information on why resilient buildings and communities need to be tough yet flexible and able to not only bounce back from acute shocks and chronic stresses, but to adapt to evolving conditions. This course will provide examples of the shocks and stresses communities and buildings can encounter. In this sense, you will learn that natural hazards aren't the only threats that communities face. Communities must also acknowledge changing conditions in the physical, economic, and social environment and be able to adapt to these changing conditions over time. Architects are critical to accomplishing both objectives, creating buildings and communities that are resilient and adaptable. Upon completion of this course, you will be able to describe shocks and stresses most critical to the built environment and the important role of architects in protecting people and property. Explain the performance attributes of hazard mitigation, resilience, and adaptation as different approaches to address shocks and stresses in the built environment. Discuss the qualities and characteristics of resilient and adaptable design strategies. Describe different roles and responsibilities for architects forwarding resilience goals. In this opening section, we will discuss the historical and evolutionary aspects of resilience and adaptation, including important events that have influenced their development. Over the last few decades, designing for sustainability has furthered the understanding of a building's impact on the environment and its role in creating and supporting a sustainable planet. This has led to designs that, for example, integrate the latest technology aimed at reducing energy use in the built environment. While sustainability predominantly focuses on the building's impact on the environment, the lens of resilience asks us to look at the environment's short and long-term impacts on the building and its occupants. Designing for resilience further acknowledges the interconnected complexities and unpredictable nature of the world today. Understanding what will make a building resilient includes understanding the impacts of social structure, environmental change, and the economics of a design project. Designing for resilience calls upon the architect to anticipate the changes and risks incurred through the duration of the building's service life and to design with these in mind. Architects have an historic opportunity to transform the built environment for the better through designing for resilience. NOAA's National Centers for Environmental Information tracks and evaluates climate events in the U.S. Since 1980, the U.S. has sustained 218 weather and climate disasters where overall damage costs reached or exceeded $1 billion. The total cost of these 218 events exceeds $1.2 trillion, and this total does not include the full costs for Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria in 2017. October 2017 had already seen 15 weather and climate disaster events with losses exceeding $202 billion. These events included 1 drought event, 2 flooding events, 1 freeze event, 7 severe storms, 3 tropical cyclone events, and 1 wildfire event. Overall, these events resulted in the deaths of 282 people and had significant economic effects on the areas impacted. Even more significant is that the trends are going in the wrong direction. From 1980 to 2016, the annual average was 5.5 events per year. The annual average for the most recent 5 years from 2012 to 2016 is 10.6 events. Whatever the root causes, the costs and impacts of disaster is rising, and architects need to be prepared to meet the challenges that this new normal will mean to their practices and to the communities where they live and work. The Stafford Act, passed in 1988, was one of the first formalized methods to improve disaster response efforts, as well as planning, preparedness, and coordination. Since then, the road to resilience has been paved by decades of increasingly deadly and costly disasters. Many have triggered changes to codes and practices. Click on the timeline to learn more about some landmark disasters and how they affected change. In addition to these, tornadoes in Moore, Oklahoma, and Joplin, Missouri, mudslides in Colorado, floods in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, earthquakes in Nisqually, Washington, and throughout Oklahoma have led to new design methodologies as communities search for ways to make their communities more resilient. The Disaster Resilience, a National Imperative report, produced by the National Institute of Building Sciences, sounded the alarm that unless the nation's approach toward hazards and disasters is changed, the cost of disasters will continue to rise both in absolute dollar amounts and in losses to the community's social, cultural, and environmental systems. The costs for short-term mitigation alone can reduce much greater longer-term losses. The 2017 interim report, Natural Hazard Mitigation Saves, found that society saves $6 for every $1 of federal agency grants spent on pre-event mitigation related to earthquakes, wind, wildland fire, and flooding. At the individual building level, it is important for architects to discuss risk management with their clients. As architects committed to protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public, this is a challenge to embrace. Listen as Edward Latch, Chief Building Science Branch at DHS FEMA, discusses the evolution of the 2017 NIBS Natural Hazard Mitigation Saves Report.
In the 10 or 12 years since then, NIBS has come to the conclusion and decided a few years ago that it was time to revisit and expand and to develop further that study. Not only did they look again at flood, wind, and earthquake, but they also looked at wildfire. And not only did they look at federal investment in mitigation, but they also now are also looking at the benefits of building above code or building in excess of current building requirements.
The increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters has spurred changes in federal guidance toward improving disaster resilience. Lessons learned from hazard events have helped shift federal disaster policy toward a more proactive approach, including FEMA's use of the hazard-resistant provisions of the International Building Code as a minimum design standard for post-disaster rebuilding, and the Government Accountability Office's recommendation to include forward-looking climate information in design standards, building codes, and certifications. In addition to these federal steps, state and local governments are striving to implement best practices for building communities that are better able to withstand and rebound from disasters, including incentivizing the construction of high-performing, hazard-resistant buildings, developing land use and zoning regulations that reduce hazard risk, adopting and enforcing model building codes, enacting mandatory retrofit programs to reduce vulnerability, proactively planning for climate adaptation, and enacting Good Samaritan legislation to facilitate the engagement of design professionals in determining the safety and habitability of homes post-disaster. Other public and nonprofit programs have been created to address resilience. Spurred by the devastation of Superstorm Sandy, the Rockefeller Foundation pioneered the 100 Resilient Cities program in 2013 to help cities respond to adverse events and better deliver basic functions in both good times and bad. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, in recognition that design innovation and cross-sector collaboration is a crucial component of resilience, launched Rebuild by Design, an effort to foster community collaboration in working towards resilience. The National Disaster Resilience Competition, a two-part resilience and education design competition, positioned design professionals as key contributors to community resilience. In addition, the International C40 Cities Network links together more than 90 megacities across the globe in a coordinated effort focused on tackling climate change and driving urban action that reduces greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks, while increasing the health, well-being, and economic opportunities of urban citizens. Resilience is an issue that affects virtually every segment of the building industry. Recognizing this, in 2015, CEOs of more than 24 leading design and construction industry associations with more than 700,000 members generating almost $1 trillion in GDP issued a joint statement on resilience, co-authored by the AIA and the National Institute of Building Sciences, entitled Industry Statement on Resilience. The CEOs committed their design and construction sector organizations to significantly improve the resilience of the nation's built environment through research into new materials, construction procedures, and other methods to improve the standard of practice. They also committed to continuous learning, advocating for effective land use policies, responding to disasters alongside first responders, and planning for future events with a strategy for fast recovery. This section of the course will provide the foundational information needed to understand the short and long-term impacts facing buildings and their occupants. This framework outlines the 4 common elements that can be used to evaluate performance and establish resilience goals: context, disturbance, capacity, and reaction. Context. Resilience must be clearly contextualized, forming a coherent answer to the question, resilience of what? A building or building component, a specific programmatic element, or a building's community function are examples of systems or processes that might be analyzed. Disturbance. Once the system of interest is determined, the next stage is to understand the potential hazards or disturbances faced, addressing the question, resilience to what? Disturbances usually take 2 forms: shocks, which are sudden acute events that impact a vulnerable system, and stresses, which are chronic trends that undermine the potential of a given system and may increase vulnerability. Systems will often face multiple, interconnected shocks and stresses. Capacity. The ability of the system to deal with the shock or stress is based on its sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. Sensitivity is the degree to which a system will be affected by a given shock or stress. Exposure is an assessment of the magnitude and frequency of shocks or the degree of stress. Together, sensitivity and exposure comprise a system's vulnerability. The adaptive capacity of a system is determined by the ability to adjust to a disturbance, moderate potential damage, take advantage of opportunities, and cope with the consequences of a transformation. Capacity answers the question, how much resilience? Reaction. A system's capacity determines its reaction. In the best case, the reaction to a shock or stress might be to bounce back better. In this case, capacities are enhanced or sensitivities and exposures are reduced, leaving a system that is more able to deal with future shocks and stresses. An alternative reaction might be to bounce back to a normal pre-existing condition or to recover but worse than before, the latter resulting in reduced capacities. In the worst-case scenario, the system might not bounce back at all, but collapse, leading to a catastrophic reduction in capacity to cope in the future. Reaction addresses the question, how well performing? and is a critical consideration for architects and their clients when discussing performance goals. Shocks are sudden events that impact the vulnerability of the system and its components. There are many different types of disaster-related shocks. These include weather and climate-related events, such as hurricanes and tornadoes, flooding, wildfires, heat waves, and blizzards. Geologic or seismic shocks include earthquakes, landslides, and land subsidence. There are other types of shocks that architects and their communities may face, including infrastructure failure or dam failure, epidemics, civil unrest, or acts of terrorism. Stresses are long-term trends that undermine the potential of a given system or process and increase the vulnerability of actors within it. These can include social, physical, and natural stresses. Of course, countries will often face multiple interconnected shocks and stresses. Stresses often exacerbate the ability for a community to recover from a disaster event. They are chronic and/or slow-moving forces whose negative impacts are felt gradually over time. Stresses weaken the fabric of a community and reduce a community's ability to respond. Social stresses, such as an aged population, physical stresses, such as an ill-maintained infrastructure and buildings, and natural stresses, such as environmental degradation and sea level rise, are the types of stresses facing communities. To mitigate stresses requires addressing both the physical built environment and the social and natural environments. For instance, with increasing air pollution, buildings may need to be designed to reduce exposure to outdoor air pollutants while also finding ways to increase social awareness of the risks of pollution and ways to reduce it through legislation. A hazard is something that is potentially dangerous or harmful. Hazards become hazard events when they impact a community, causing direct, indirect, or consequential damage that affects natural resources, infrastructure, transportation, utilities, and the exterior or interior of buildings. A hazard event becomes a disaster when the impact of the hazard event is of such great intensity that it overwhelms the local capacity to respond. A shock is another term for a hazard event or disaster that is acute, unexpected or sudden, and traumatic. The probability that a given hazard may occur is known as hazard risk. Disaster risk, or the measure of the potential impact that a hazard event could have on a community, is determined by the overlap between hazard risk and vulnerability. Geographic location is the primary determinant of a community's risk to natural hazards. Those that choose to occupy coastal land or areas along a riverbank are at higher risk for flooding. Those that reside in the Midwest may be susceptible to tornadoes, and those on the west coast of the United States have a significantly higher seismic risk. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, defines vulnerability as the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects. Community components such as populations, economies, buildings, infrastructure, and natural systems individually have vulnerabilities that interdependently and collectively contribute to community risk. Vulnerability is a dynamic condition which changes over time in response to interacting variables and local factors. Many hazards induce or trigger secondary hazards. These vary by location and need to be taken into consideration during planning, mitigation, and response efforts. For example, earthquakes may down power lines, triggering fires. Flooding can lead to drinking water contamination. These multi-hazard events are not specifically addressed in building codes, thus it is important to consider secondary and tertiary hazards as well as the initial event when designing for resiliency. The cascading effects of an initial event are like dominoes falling, compounding efforts to restore safety and normalcy to a community. Cascading effects are complex and multidimensional and evolve constantly over time. They are associated more with a community's vulnerability than with the hazards that a community might be subject to. And even low-level hazards can generate broad chain effects if vulnerabilities are widespread in the system or not addressed properly in subsystems. For example, a big rain event can cause a secondary hazard of flash flooding, which in turn causes multiple cascading events such as power outages and infrastructure destruction. Or a windstorm event can trigger a power outage as a secondary hazard that in turn can trigger a range of cascading effects such as water supply and distribution pump failures, sewage treatment plant shutdown, gas station closures, and more. Taken together, the effect of cascading events can be crippling to a community. Building codes focus primarily on life safety. In other words, occupants will be able to get out of a building safely, but that doesn't guarantee when or if they will be able to return. Even emerging performance-based code provisions still focus on life safety issues and not operational continuity. While life safety is, of course, essential, it may not be enough in the context of increasing hazard risk and the objective of designing for property protection and continuity of operations. Listen as architect Steve Winkle describes the anticipated performance attributes of a code-compliant building.
Building codes, as they're currently constituted, are built around the concept of life safety. And in that sense, whether you're talking about seismic design or fire, wind, or other natural hazards, the codes are very well developed at this point in time to be very effective in achieving life safety. That I think it's fairly safe to make a prediction in a maximum, even a maximum credible earthquake, which is even above the design standards for earthquake design, that there would be few or no casualties in a building, so that people are going to be able to get out of the building in an emergency. What people don't typically understand about building code design is that as a life safety basis, it is not designed for continuity of occupancy or for continued use of the building in terms of it's kind of a revealing conversation with clients when, let's say, the architect and the structural engineer are sitting down to talk about the building code, anticipated building code performance of the building with a client, telling them that, yes, this building will get all of the occupants of your building out safely under the scenario we're designing for, but the building will probably, in a large earthquake event, be unusable. That you're simply going to walk out the door and close and lock the door and come back and tear it down. So that then you start the discussion with the client at that point saying, well, I need to be back up in business in a certain number of days. And I say, well, in order to do that, for whatever risk you're talking about, whether it's seismic design or wind or rain or water intrusion, there's going to be a cost associated with improving the performance of the building beyond the building code minimum.
3 levels of beyond code performance that architects might consider are sheltering in place, passive survivability, and continuity of operations. Sheltering in place means exactly that, the ability to safely ride out a hazard event inside a facility. While the building may not be able to function after the event is over, it will be sufficiently robust, or it will have sufficient safe areas within it, so that occupants will be able to remain safe inside during the event itself. Passive survivability refers to the ability of a building to maintain reasonable, basic functionality after an event, specifically an event that includes an extended power outage. The building needs to be intact, and thermal, power, and potable water systems should be minimally functional, not necessarily up to pre-event operational standards, but sufficient to allow occupants to remain in the building while critical services are restored. Continuity of operations is a higher standard, basically requiring a facility to withstand the impact of a disaster event and remain fully or close to fully functional in the aftermath. This standard currently applies to essential facilities like hospitals, police stations, and fire stations, but not to other occupancy types. Going forward, it is likely that designing for resilience will require addressing continuity of operations in these non-essential occupancies as well. In this new and evolving context, architects will need to understand their clients' post-disaster operational requirements and design facilities to meet them. Capacity to respond to disaster events will vary from community to community. While communities equipped with trauma hospitals and critical facilities are better able to respond to hazard events than communities without these capabilities, the facilities that house these functions are required to be built and maintained to a higher performance standard in order to maintain continuity of operations. Conversely, communities with fewer resources and limited capacity will be less able to respond to and will take a longer time to recover from a disaster event. Each community will need to develop specific resilience plans that are appropriate for the individual needs, conditions, and capacities of that particular community. The steps to develop these plans may be roughly the same, but the plans that will result, and should, vary from community to community. Click on the icon to learn about a. Listen as planner Scott Davis discusses the relationship between sustainability and resilience.
An interesting way to think about the link between sustainability and resilience is that they're complementary concepts. They both have to do with ensuring that something is designed to have kind of a long-term viability in a healthy state. Sustainability really looks at itself from the central tenet of the products that are produced, the outputs of a structure on the world and in the environment in terms of energy or other kind of resources or negative outputs. Resilience is really about how the building responds to negative inputs, other negative forces or hazards that will impact the building. So in simpler terms, sustainability is really about the impact of a thing on the world, and resilience is really about the impact of the world on a thing. Resilience is really a fundamental principle of sustainability. If you think about how can something be sustainable for the long term if it doesn't consider risk, right? And so if something isn't considering risk, then it's not sustainable for a long-term viability in a healthy state. And if that's not the case, then it can't be sustainable. So I think consideration of risk and resilience and vulnerability is really a fundamental principle of sustainability.
There are synergies between sustainability and resilience. Passive strategies such as increased insulation for energy efficiency, for example, is an area where sustainable design and resilient design align well. Increased insulation contributes to a facility that can maintain comfort and passive survivability in the aftermath of a disaster that knocks out power. In addition, a more efficient building will extend the fuel efficiency of any backup power system that a facility may have. And if that backup power is provided by a well-anchored PV system, the link between sustainability and resilient design is even stronger. Although many synergies exist between sustainability and resilience, the two design objectives do not always align. For example, a vegetated roof might have clear energy and environmental benefits, but may also require a significantly stronger structural system, especially in earthquake country, that can add costs that may outweigh the benefits. In such a situation, an architect could suggest a different type of stormwater management and roof design, perhaps focusing on rainwater harvesting or on beefing up the insulation to provide more energy benefits. Likewise, rooftop PV can be a great sustainable design option, but care must be taken in high wind areas to ensure panels do not become airborne in the event of a strong storm. This can be a matter of thoughtfully attaching detailing, or the architect could specify a thin film PV product that could better withstand wind loads. The trade-off is that thin film systems are typically less efficient than most crystalline panel systems. Either way, architects will need to weigh the sustainability and resilience benefits of alternate approaches in order to optimize systems, create synergies, and achieve the project's performance goals. As part of the natural evolution,
I'm going to stop there and just show you all where you can find more information related to AIA's Resilience and Adaptation Initiative. If you go to AIA.org/resilience initiative, you can find several
Sorry to interrupt. We're just seeing a black screen, I think, because of your screen sharing selection.
Okay, hold on.
Just do share the whole screen instead of the window. There we go. Now we can see it.
There you go. Yeah, so if you go to AIA.org/resilience initiative, you can find a bunch of really great resources. And Ashley shared the link to the rest of this AIA course if you're interested. So I'm going to pass it off to Miguel, who's with us, and he's going to talk a little bit about how this all relates to us here in Austin.
Thanks, Kendall. How's everybody doing? So we're going to have a fun conversation, and I'll introduce you to our panelists. This has a lot to do, what we just saw in AIU content has a lot to do with kind of the themes and framework of thinking that we have here at Positive Energy. And in particular, with regard to what happened with Winter Storm Uri back in February, we wanted to kind of present some thoughts about what happened, what's currently happening, and we'll dive into how you can better prepare. But the title here, One Wheel Down and the Axle Dragging, that's actually what my grandfather used to say when I'd ask him how his day was and he had a bad day. And I was like, that's such a perfect way to describe the Texas grid. So we're going to talk about when the grid collapsed and how it never really fully recovered even still. Let's see here. So my name is Miguel. Obviously, I'm with Positive Energy here in Austin. We have been an MEP firm for a long time, kind of a vanguard, very forward-thinking firm. And now we do a considerable amount of passive systems and resilient systems consulting as well. So actually helping architecture teams think through problems in this space. And I'm very pleased to introduce two colleagues who work with me at Positive Energy, Dr. Charles Upshaw and Dr. Josh Rhodes. They are also involved in their own endeavors, the company called IdeaSmiths that I'll let them introduce to you in just a moment. But Charlie is the lead engineer at Positive Energy, so his footprint is pretty broad. He touches pretty much every project, whether it's on the consulting side or the MEP side. And Josh is our resident research fellow. So when we have big questions that we don't know how to answer, we call Josh and say, please help. And so actually, this is a really good opportunity for the two of you to introduce yourselves if you want to say anything else and maybe tell us a little bit about IdeaSmith's work as well. That'd be great. Well, we'll start with you, Charlie.
Sure, yeah. So I'm Charlie Upshaw, lead engineer here at Positive Energy. And maybe some of you remember the talk that I gave on resilient systems and architecture at AIA Austin conference last year that, turned out to be pretty prescient. So something I've been thinking about and talking about for a long time, I've done research in. And, it was something that I knew was likely to happen and was inevitably going to happen at some point. But even I, somebody who lives and breathes it on a daily basis, never really fully internalized the fact that it was going to happen, sooner rather than later. So when it happened, it kind of was oh yeah, this is exactly what I was talking about. And all of those cascading failures and interdependencies of the systems failed like we thought they would and caused a lot of problems like we thought they would. So yeah, that's something that Josh and I think a lot about, do a lot of work on. Our company IdeaSmiths does broader consulting more on the grid side of things. Josh, you want to introduce yourself and talk more about IdeaSmiths?
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me, everyone. So Joshua Rose, I wear multiple different hats, sometimes on the same day. So I work at the University of Texas as well. I do research there, teach. Also, as Miguel and Charlie talked about, founding partner of IdeaSmiths, where we do a lot of systems level analysis of energy systems and technology vetting and basically anything that touches the energy systems that we have with a big focus on the electricity sector, and then also moonlight here and there for Positive Energy, as Miguel said, with some big picture question stuff. So lots of different hats, although I don't actually have a hat for each one of those, but I wish I did.
We should get hats at some
We should get hats.
Okay. We can at least get you a Positive Energy hat.
Perfect.
We do have some of those for you, Josh.
Yeah, and so I've been doing a lot of work around, my main focus is the Texas electricity grid. I've been busy since February, and since a lot of people now know what ERCOT is, it is a little bit easier to explain. And then we have all had a little bit of PTSD this week from the February event. So happy to talk about kind of what I know about that. I'm doing some work right now for the Public Utility Commission, doing a postmortem on the event. We're almost done with that report. Hopefully it'll be released in a couple weeks. And then, yeah, just looking at what I know from this week as well. Happy to chat.
That's great. And so before I'll kind of do my unpacking of the event just in very simple terms. But before we get there, why don't you guys tell us how you started IdeaSmiths, because I think that story is hilarious and quite fun. It's a good anecdote.
Very briefly, the whole entire impetus was the movie Transformers 4, Revenge of the Fallen. They were looking for some energy stuff for Mark Wahlberg's character, who was a crazy inventor guy. And they reached out to our research group, and Josh and I were like, well, we can build a wind turbine out of junk. Like, yeah, is that the kind of prop you're looking for? And that's what they wanted. And then when it came time to invoice them, they were like, send us an invoice. And we were like, what is that? Like, and so we're like, we should form a company so we can invoice people.
That's great. Thanks, Charlie. So kind of very broadly, and I'll give Charlie and Josh the chance to respond to this as well, but what happened in February? I took a stab at summarizing this as simply as possible. This is where I landed. After decades of strategic grid deregulation intended to cut down the cost of providing electricity, the state's power providers, along with the Public Utility Commission of Texas, the PUC, and the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT, dramatically underestimated the potential impact that a series of storms and prolonged freezing weather would have on the state of Texas, resulting in over 100 hours without electricity for many Texans in sub-freezing temperatures as various interconnected grid infrastructure collapsed. This was not fun at all. It really, really sucked. I can speak personally to how bad it sucked being kind of a refugee from 100-year-old house to the next as various infrastructure failed. And frankly, for the entire state, it was a devastating loss. The state has claimed 151 people died as a result of that outage, but there have been some subsequent analyses using statistical excessive death modeling, which suggests somewhere between 426 to 978. So, average of 700 of people likely died as a result of the storm in February, which is tremendous loss to the state.
I believe that is the most highest mortality rate for a natural disaster since, I can't remember the name of the hurricane, but the hurricane that hit Galveston. In 1901 or whatever.
Yeah, and in terms of, if people don't like to think about death or talk about death in pure economic terms, it was the fourth most expensive natural, I use that in air quotes, natural disaster in world history. It's the estimates are between 125 to 225 billion. No, sorry, 195 to 295 billion dollars in damage. And to date, not much has happened, frankly. We have been reassured by legislators and the governor that everything is fine and all that can be done has been done. And there has frankly been little evidence to support those claims. And so we, as Texans, remain vulnerable. This is my partner and I during the freeze. This is our house that you can see the temperature there on the monitor. It was around 31, 32 degrees floating in my house pretty consistently during the daylight hours. And that dropped off from about 65 degrees pretty quick because I live in a 100-year-old house with no insulation. There's Charlie. He took advantage of the storm.
I disagree with your statement that it was zero fun. I had about 30 minutes of fun. Yeah.
30 minutes. But I love your refrigerator photo here. I think that's great.
Yeah, to provide a little bit of context, on the right there, that was, I think, a photo I sent the Positive Energy team saying like, hey, do you like my new refrigerator? Because I was cleaning out my refrigerator. I didn't want, stuff to go bad in there. And it was colder in my house than in the refrigerator by, 5 degrees. So I just kind of like left a bunch of stuff on the floor for a little while.
And then why don't you tell us about the graph that you put in the slide on the left where you circled bad? What does that mean?
Yeah, so, and if you look at the timestamp on that, that was Sunday, February 14th at 4 p.m. Or so. And yeah, that graph, the top line is what kind of generation is available on the grid, and the green line is where the consumption, the power demand actually was at that point. And they were projecting a shortfall coming up. And this was something that was kind of foreseen definitely hours and days in advance as the cold weather was setting in and the weather forecasts started coming in, consistently showing these super cold sustained temperatures. Yeah, so that there was some text messages going around between Josh and myself and our other partners and folks at Positive Energy, like, hey, this is going to be really bad. So just prepare.
I remember that well. Yeah. I thought this was a great meme that I actually saw this week, because we're still under an ERCOT advisory to reduce power consumption this week, because there were some scheduled outages, but obviously some coordination issues between plants that were still experiencing repairs after the storm, and then the scheduled outages. So if you're an Office fan, this resonates quite well. But here's where I want to get to, and here's where I'd like to take our conversation. So I want to talk about what happened. I want to talk about what's happening now. I want to talk about how architects can prepare for the existing grid conditions, and which I now consider them fully changing and heading into future grid conditions. Let's talk about batteries and solar and generators. Let's talk about the enclosure, and then we can kind of summarize there. So I'm going to kick the first question off to Josh. Josh, why don't you, in your best summary, explain to the group what happened in February?
Yeah, so with the in danger of using an overused term, it was a pretty perfect storm in February for Texas. And so what happened in Texas happened in ERCOT, and I mean, as you know, we had an extreme winter storm. We had a polar vortex come down, and it dropped the temperatures across the state to levels that they hadn't really been to in such a wide part of the state since 1989. So we have to go back to 1989 before we can really have a comparable amount of cold for that long. And even then, in 2021 was the first time that every single county in Texas was under a winter storm warning at the exact same time. And that temporal aligning is very important, because like with electricity, you have to match supply and demand in real time. And so if a weather event moves across the state and affects part of the state, and then moves to another part, and then moves to another part, there can be some temporal smoothing of that demand. But in this point, we had everybody at the exact same time was wanting heat at this point. And usually when I say that sentence, I'm talking about air conditioning, but we were talking about heat. And so we ended up in a situation where if we had been able to meet all of the demand for electricity that would have been put on the system, we would have blown away even our summer peaks by quite a bit. Like, we tend to, when you think of Texas, you don't think of snow and ice, you think of, hot summers and sun. But this would have blown away all our previous records. At the same time, we lost close to half of our power plants for a variety of different reasons. As the weather event moved kind of from the northwest down through in Texas, we lost a lot of our wind facilities out there. We had a lot of icing up of our wind turbines. And then as the temperature moved along, we lost a lot of our thermal plants. Thermal plants have cooling water just like your car has a radiator, and a lot of those froze, and they were not able to keep the keep the power plants cool, or they had sensor lines trip off, or a whole bunch of other things. At the same time, half of our power plants that are fueled by natural gas, we couldn't actually get the amount of natural gas to them that they were demanding. And at the exact same time as well, 40% of homes and businesses in Texas are demanding natural gas for heating. And so we ran out of natural gas. We had wells freeze up, we had processing facilities freeze up. That led to curtailments of natural gas going to power plants. The way that the order of operations works is they send it to homes first, and then during that event, at least send it to power plant second and industrial commercial third. But we ended up in this situation where we were down half of the generation capacity that we have on the system while we were demanding the most amount of electricity that we've ever demanded from the system. And because you have to match supply and demand, we had to shed load. Because if we had not shed load, the entire thing could have gone down. And if the entire thing goes down for long enough, it could take weeks, if not months sometimes, depending on how much damage is done during the catastrophic failure, to actually bring it back online. And so we ended up in this situation where, we didn't have many good options, and that left a lot of people in the dark for a long time. I was one of the unfortunate ones who was, in the dark for, 4 days straight. The blackouts were supposed to roll. Obviously they didn't for many people. And the reason, given for that was that, for rolling blackouts, you have to turn one feeder off before you can turn another feeder on. And there was so much critical load that they have to keep on, think hospitals, fire, EMS, things like that, that they were not able to turn off any more circuits in order to turn others on. And so we ended up in this situation where they just could not roll that usage around. And so you ended up with people with, it's getting, close to freezing or is freezing inside of their homes. And so that's kind of the high level view, and I'll just,
when you say the perfect storm, right? And so many power plants dropped off the grid so precipitously, that is why a lot of cities found themselves in the position of not being able to roll blackouts, because it was just, we hit the cliff and it fell off, and that's where we were, and that's what we had to stick with for the duration of the freezing weather, so long as those plants were still down. Is that correct?
Yeah, so to bring people back, to turn people's power back on, we had to bring more power plants back online. And that was hampered by roads that were also completely impassable. No one here has snow tires. We don't have snow plows. Texas cities had already used the one-time pile of gravel and salt that they might actually have, because we actually had a snow event a few weeks before. Everyone's forgotten about that one, but we had a snow event like a little bit before. So all the cities used all of their stuff, and we had nothing left to go. And so some issues where we just couldn't get crews out to fix transformers or the power plants or transmission lines or all kinds of things like that.
Yeah. And so Charlie, this question's for you. Why was it that homes and buildings were demanding so much heat at the same time whenever the storms rolled through? Could you walk us through a little bit of the background on that?
Yeah, so our climate is typically fairly mild. It gets kind of cold, but not like Minnesota cold or something like that, right? It's designed more for cooling, like air conditioning versus heating. And even during the hottest times of the day, we have a spike in temperature in the afternoons and into the evenings, where the sun is shining, it's late in the afternoon. That's when there's the highest demand for air conditioning on the grid. But then nighttime occurs, it cools off a little bit outside. You get some radiant heat rejection from the outside of the building and the surrounding areas into the night, and the temperature drops off a little bit, which lessens the air conditioning demand into those early morning hours, through the night and into the morning hours the next day. So that kind of allows the system a little bit of break and allows for air conditioners to kind of cycle and recover and recool the buildings and everything like that. So there's this kind of, there's still some stochasticity or cycling and variability in the cooling load. With the winter event, we didn't see any of that. It was well below our design temperatures, close to or exceeding our all-time low temperatures for days at a time. which means that every single heater is running flat out because the heating systems in the houses are sized to run, you know, at capacity at the design temperature, and we were well below it. So that just means the heater is going to be on for a week straight. Right. And we had people kind of forget, but the event really actually started the week before, where we had an ice storm, and it was just, you know, it was really cold, but not as cold as it got. And so that cooled all of the buildings down already, cooled all the, you know, surrounding surfaces down. So everything was already, there's no kind of thermal mass left in the buildings and in the systems when that really cold air hit. So there's just simultaneous demand from every single building for as much heating capacity as they had. And in Texas, we have a huge component of our building stock has electric resistance heating, especially a lot of the rural areas. They don't have natural gas supplied to them, and our heating loads aren't so much that, you know, having electric resistance heating is just kind of the cheapest default option. Similarly, a lot of the heat pumps that are installed out there are kind of older generation, and they don't do well at very cold temperatures, and they go into an electric resistance heating mode. And so, you know, what we saw was maximum demand from all of the houses that have natural gas heating. And simultaneously, we saw maximum demand from all of the houses that have electric resistance or heat pump heating. We saw something at like a 5 to 7 times increase in the energy usage from homes during that span of time. And all of that was basically heating load, which is hard to design and hard to plan for.
Yeah. Well, and two things that strike me as you're saying this is, you know, in summer months when there are outages, there's some relief, as you say, when the sun goes down, you know, systems are able to recover and there's less demand on the total grid. And it's also such that, you know, the difference between 100 degrees, even 108 degrees outside and 78 degrees inside is not as big as the difference between 65 degrees inside and 8 degrees outside, right? So there's sort of that component to it as well. So Josh, I'm actually curious. You were touching on some of the interconnected natures of grid infrastructure. Could you speak just a little more to that, right? The ripple effect of a big outage like this? Because I think what I want to drill down into as we get into the discussion is the idea that, you know, how we design enclosures, how we design mechanical systems, how we think about architectural performance is actually a part of this, and how we bake in resilient features, right? Whether renewables, whether batteries, whether generators, and water systems, how those all play into this, because there's that system kind of grouping at the home level, and then there's sort of this infrastructural grouping of systems at the state level. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so like at the macro system level, in ERCOT, about half of our power plants consume natural gas. And so when, you know, natural gas supplies were low, you know, when natural gas supply, we're not able to supply natural gas to power plants, we lost some power plants for fuel delivery issues. We also did same for coal. We had coal piles freeze and they weren't able to use as well. But then there was some interplay between that, because a lot of the compressors that that charge the natural gas descended across pipelines are electrically driven. And we had some power that was cut to natural gas infrastructure. And so that further hampered the ability of natural gas to flow to power plants. And then you ended up in this disvirtuous cycle, where you're just cycling down of less availability, less availability, less availability. Then we ended up on our water side, you know, a lot of, you know, the water sector has a lot of storage, you know, the water towers and things that we see out there, but we don't have unlimited amount of storage. And because a lot of people were dripping their faucets and we had a lot of pipes and things burst in homes, we ended up, you know, putting more, taxing our water system. In some places, the electricity had been cut off to the water system, so they were not able to pump more water and were not able to move more water. And we ended up having to do all these water boil notices because we depressurized our water system. And utility planners know that pipes leak. there's just too many roads and too many undergrounds. We know that they leak, and so they overpressurize them so that they leak out, because you can control what's in the pipe. But if the pressure inside the pipe is too low, they actually act as French drains. Stuff gets in, and you have no idea what is in that water, and you do not want to drink it. And so that was one of the reasons why we had so many water boil notices, was that we did not have sufficient pressure in our pipelines to guarantee that the water was leaking out. It could have been leaking in. And so, we ended up that away. And then we had, pipes and things burst in people's homes, which, now there's a lot of people are having to replace cabinetry and sheetrock and all kinds of stuff, because, their pipes either weren't insulated enough, or there was an exposed section, or the insulation had fallen off, or all kinds of things. But like every single bit of this infrastructure all relies on, each other. And so when one goes down, it can take the other down, which then can take that one down and this other one down, and a whole bunch of different types of cascading failures that we ended up seeing in February. I'll stop there.
Okay, great. So it actually makes me think, since this is such a systemic issue, what has happened at the state level since then? I know there was a lot of blustery language, a lot of blame being passed around after the storm. What has actually gone on, whether it's at the political landscape, the regulatory landscape? Like, what does that look like now, and what can we expect in the next or in the coming years?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the omnibus response was Senate Bill 3 that was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor last week or so. And that one, that legislation has some winterization standards for power plants and for some pieces of the natural gas infrastructure. Although, as most legislation, it's quite broad in terms of it's not prescriptive, which you actually don't want it to be prescriptive, because then you need a law to change it. If you're like, I want every power plant to be able to go down to 5 degrees. Well, if we're going to experience 0 degrees, you have to have a law that says you have to go down to 0 degrees. So typically what they do is they make this a little bit more, they make it more broad. And so what will happen next is that will filter down to the Public Utility Commission of Texas, which regulates electricity in the state. And then some of that will filter down to ERCOT, who actually runs the power grid itself, to determine what level of winterization needs to happen. What are the actual X, Y, and Z that actually need to get done in order to satisfy the law. I personally do worry that we're not doing enough on the natural gas side, because you can winterize a power plant all you want, great, fine. If you can't get fuel to it, it's just a big hunk of steel in the ground doing you not much good. And so yeah, and then there's a bunch of other bills and responses that have to do with the financial side of this. There's still roughly $2.1 billion in short pays that have not been paid out for that week, and they're trying to figure out how they're going to allocate those costs. And eventually we will all pay for it. I mean, the money has to come from somewhere, and so eventually we will. They got to figure out now how fast and when does it start. And there's some other governance things, like how ERCOT is managed and how many members of the PUC, and a bunch of other stuff too.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But fundamentally, there are also a bunch of bills about trying to help, increase the resiliency of buildings, increasing energy efficiency for buildings, and the whole trying to address the demand side of things. There's kind of the supply component. Do you have the power generation capacity available when it is needed? And then there's the demand component, like how much will be needed. And all of the legislation that passed was on the supply side of things. I don't think any real legislation passed for the demand side of things in terms of trying to help customers, increase the energy efficiency through rebates or something like that, or passing of more stringent building codes or something of that nature.
Well, let's continue to take it there, Charlie. So, given that the regulatory landscape is still relatively uncertain, and given that the state has not responded to the demand side of things at all, how do architects actually start to independently make their buildings and homes that they're designing more resilient? Like, what are the kind of key elements to really start drilling into as you're thinking about designing for the future?
Yeah, so if you want to roll to the next slide, Miguel, I grabbed a few slides from some of our resilient systems pre-design offerings. This one is from a report by the Rocky Mountain Institute. It's modeled for the mountain environment, but it is indicative of how different building types perform. And what this graph is showing is, a significant drop in temperature down into the 0 and negative, down to -20. And the resulting kind of change in a building indoor temperature after a simulated power outage. And the different line kind of gradations there show buildings built in 1950, 1980, code minimum, current code minimum, up to passive house. That's the one at the top, the light green one. And so what this is showing is sort of the effects of a high performance envelope and a super tight building and how it performs under really extreme conditions. And the steepness of the curve and the drop off in the indoor temperature, if you lost power for a significant period of time, you kind of have a internal understanding of this now. I live in a 1970s house, and it went from, I think we had it at 70 or 69 or something like that, down to 53. We lost power at 1:30 in the morning, and at 6:30 in the morning, it was like 50 something degrees and low 50s inside. And so if you have more insulation and your building is tighter, you are able to just kind of coast much longer with before your interior temperature drops outside of uncomfortable and then into unsafe levels. So
yeah, I'm reminded of when this happened. The folks who still had access to data during the set of positive energy, and some of our colleagues were saying, "Hey, get out your battery-powered data loggers. Let's actually, do some research, make some lemonade out of this situation." And my house, as you say, it's a 1919 build with no insulation, and it was well into the 30s pretty quick. I mean, it was within probably 5 hours or so. Checked in at the old house I lived at, which was a 2009 code built house, and it was pretty much 48 hours on the dot, which is kind of what this study was indicating. And then, of course, our good friend with a passive house never dropped below 50 for the duration of the outage, which is pretty phenomenal. I think you could burp and probably keep that house warm. So that's pretty amazing. Of course, anecdotal, but pretty amazing relation there.
Big picture, the higher performance your envelope is, the less energy input you need for it to sort of sustain a comfortable or livable temperature inside. And this goes from a kind of heating perspective or from a cooling perspective. And I guess the point to get across here is that passive house and these other high performance building standards, it's not just about operational energy. A big component of it is definitely the operational energy and kind of sustainability, energy efficiency of the home. And that is a great benefit that it provides all the time. But it is also a resilient kind of component as well. The higher performing and tighter your envelope is, the less you have to do in the event of a power outage to keep it comfortable. That means less battery power capacity or generator, less fuel stored on site for your generator. And so you just get so much more performance out of it versus a code minimum built house.
That actually makes me, it sounds like you're describing, the way that you describe that, it's almost like you're describing the enclosure itself as a battery or a battery equivalent. So maybe we can talk about that. Like, I know there has been a tremendous discussion about renewables. There have been tremendous discussions about backup generators, and I know that there are many types of those. So let's start talking about sort of the difference in terms of where investment should go when you're designing a project into backup systems, into renewable systems, or into an enclosure? What's that landscape look like? And either Charlie or Josh, feel free to take a stab at this one.
Yeah, I'd say, you know, the lowest hanging fruit and best thing you can do is make your envelope better, make it tighter. Insulation is important. Windows are more important. The performance of those windows and the size of those windows. That is another thing to get across is a really tight house with really high performance windows is still not as good as a house that has more walls than windows to it.
Are you suggesting that an all glass skyscraper might not be the best design for a sustainable building?
A glass box makes a poor cooler. You know, like you wouldn't want to use a fish tank as a cooler. You'd want to use a cooler as a cooler, I guess is what I'm kind of getting at. And that's and I know I'm talking to a bunch of architects, and I know architects love windows. So, you know, I see Kendall shaking her head.
That's a good reminder.
Yes. And I understand that, you know, windows and nice views and everything are beautiful. It's something, though, to talk to your clients and ask them about their priorities. If their number one priority is building a resilient home, then there should be some additional considerations made to the extent of glazing in the home and where it is, because some glazing is actually very beneficial in, you know, winter design sort of scenarios where you can get that passive heating into the house. That can be critical in helping it maintain its temperature. And that's how, you know, the original passive house movement was all born, you know, around trying to kind of capture that solar energy and keep it in the summer in Texas. If we have a power outage, you really don't want a whole bunch of glass that can let a bunch of light in at inopportune times. So, you know, I guess what I'm getting at is the envelope is a critical component and factor in the resiliency of the building. And it can be helpful or a hindrance to, you know, how that building performs in an outage. And so I would start there. You can always slap solar panels on a house, and that will help reduce its operational energy efficiency and not reduce its energy efficiency, help reduce its operational energy consumption. Right. It'll increase its energy efficiency per se, effective energy efficiency. But you can only put so much on the roof. And those solar panels are only helpful as long as you're connected to the grid if you don't have a battery system. And the less efficient your house is, the bigger that battery needs to be and the bigger the solar array needs to be to kind of maintain operations and maintain comfort during an outage. And same thing with the generator. The bigger the fuel, you know, fossil fuel powered generator will have to be to run the building heating and cooling systems, and the more fuel you will have to store on site to be able to run those systems.
Well, and Josh kind of pointed to, you know, the idea that natural gas infrastructure was sort of systemically failing. And if you're, it seems like if you have a natural gas generator for your whole house, which is quite common in many parts of the United States, maybe less so in Texas, that would likely not be a super reliable way to keep your house operational during such an outage.
Well, I mean, I think it's like my mom actually had one installed like 2 weeks before the event, and like was pretty happy about having said it was run off a propane tank, so it was like, you know, okay, there's an on-site storage there because it's out in East Texas. But yeah, I'm not aware of any for this event. I wasn't aware of any like residential that got cut off from natural gas. I could be wrong. Okay. But there was the Railroad Commission, which regulates oil and gas, does not regulate railroads in Texas, has an order of operations, like gas goes to homes and businesses first, then it would go to power plants, and then to commercial and industrial. So I'm not aware of any that lost. I could be wrong on that, but just as yeah. And then
I don't think that there were any outages yet, or in this case from like over demand from natural gas generators. My fear is if a lot of people go out and buy natural gas generators, their natural gas consumption rivals or exceeds the rest of the house consumption. So it would essentially be doubling or more the density of natural gas consumption at a home. And if you had a high percentage within a neighborhood, you could see a significant increase in natural gas demand, just, you know, depressurizing the local system.
That's a great point.
And, you know, there are other ways in which natural gas infrastructure could fail. It has historically been pretty reliable in Texas, but it is not immune to failure. So it's kind of like you're still relying on a utility and an outside source to provide you the fuel that you need to power your off-grid system in real time.
Yeah. So there was a quick audience question before we get too far away from Windows, because it pertains to Windows. The question is, what is the ideal window to wall ratio to improve performance? $1,000,000 question, right?
The ideal one is 0%, you know, like a cooler, a refrigerated box would be the most ideal from like a pure energy standpoint, right? Or, you know, like one of my professors used to say that the most like low energy building you could build is a tent, right? With no air conditioning. That's like the most sustainable, efficient, low energy building you could build. So it's more of a question of give and take. There's no hard and fast number. You know,
let's
kind
assume
of
good daylighting, Charlie. Let's assume good daylighting.
That's a Corey question right there.
Right?
Yeah, you'll have to get Corey to answer that question. But I'll say, you know, just going kind of default floor to the ceiling windows and, you know, all the rooms, those sorts of things. Like a window is a terrible wall from an insulation standpoint, and it also lets through heat in the form of you know, visible and infrared rays and all that kind of stuff. So even if you have really high performance passive house glass, that's still a marginal window compared to, or sorry, a marginal wall compared to kind of a code minimum wall.
Right.
So kind of like being strategic about that will just, you know, kind of increase the benefit.
Yeah, and
Josh,
we've been kind of talking around, and Charlie's talked about it with Windows and things, but I mean, I think really when you're talking about like, you know, resilience, it's really like recognizing what are the things you're working against, right? Because like, you know, where gravity never stops, water doesn't stop, heat doesn't stop, right? And so like figuring out, you know, how to best design and build something that, even if it's not taking advantage of those, is like minimizing their impact. So like, you know, overhangs on windows that, you know, allow that wanted winter light to come in, but block, you know, the summer light from coming in. You know, proper slopes and like, you know, all kinds of things that like, you know, keep all these things away that don't stop working for us. It's like, what are the passive things? It doesn't have, maybe not passive house, but what are the, you know, the passive things that can be, you know, worked into it so that, you know, because the more you're fighting those, the more active systems you need, and the more, you know, in your energy inputs have to go into creating a space that's like habitable and livable. So I mean, that's the way I tend to think about it. It's like, what are the things we're constantly fighting against, and how do we like, you know, design to make those fights as small as possible, so that the active systems that we bring in to mop up the rest can be as small and use as less energy as possible.
Right. So that actually leads into questions about orientation, about kind of the way that you're massing a building, you know, during the concept part of the design
traditional
process.
Environmental design stuff.
Yeah.
Great.
And even like the way that the building faces, like if you want to have a building that does, you know, is solar powered and great, well, you need a pretty clear roof that faces, you know, southwest, you know, type area, and that comes in like, if a new subdivision, which way did the streets go? Because the houses usually snap to the streets, and then they'll have a certain orientation and all of this kind of thing. So it's like, you know, that whole systems level thinking of like, you know, how do we design it such that like the job is easier down the road than making it harder on ourselves.
There's another question from the question and answer box. were there any lessons learned for emergency operations centers after the freeze? Was that is that something that you guys know much about in your purview?
Let the electric utility know that you are a critical load, because if you don't let them know you're a critical load, they will turn you off.
That's great. That's great. So
Lesson
you architects, make sure
#1.
you're putting that into the operations manual for clients
that
are in that boat.
I mean, definitely one of the things we saw was there were some critical loads that had not told the electric utility that they were critical loads. And so when the electric utility had to cut circuits, they were trying to cut circuits that did not have critical loads. And because they didn't know some existed, they cut some circuits that did have critical load on them. We really saw this in 2011. I thought we learned a lesson, apparently not, because it happened again in February. But it's like that information has to be passed along to the utility so that they know where you are and what you're doing.
Got it. Got it. Well, that actually kind of, there's an interesting discussion, I think, to be had around, a lot of people that I heard after the freeze were talking about, like, well, the power company knows how to turn my power on and off when I'm moving into a new house, for example. Why couldn't they roll blackouts at that granularity, right? Why couldn't they actually turn on, these 4 houses or those 4 houses while they're turning off, an equal number somewhere else? Let's maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so the majority of buildings in Texas have smart meters and have the ability to remote connect and disconnect. The thing is the back end that services that can only handle a few thousand per day. And so if we wanted to adequately roll blackouts using meters, we would have needed to have done millions per day in order to, keep people's outages at, an hour length or 45-minute length or whatever they were promising that they would be. And so we technically have the potential to do that, but we don't have the system in place that would actually allow that to happen. It's basically like we would be trying to do it with dial-up, and you really need gigabit internet to do that type of thing.
Got it. So it's just not a high bandwidth network then.
Yeah, there's we haven't really touched on kind of IT and information networks and the interdependency and critical nature of those for energy and water systems, and that's probably one of the lessons learned with the operation centers is communication. There was just insufficient communication across the board by pretty much everybody, especially from ERCOT and utilities and others in power to customers, but also from utilities to other utilities, or utilities having insight into exactly what was happening on their networks, on their distribution facilities. The kind of question about being able to roll at the meter level, that's very much just essentially an internet bandwidth issue. They don't run over the internet, they have their own networks, but they just don't have that capability, like Josh was saying. But they do have some level of robust control at the kind of circuit or distribution substation level. And that's the level of granularity that they use for controlling those rolling outages. It'll be interesting to see as we move forward if utilities push to make that control point smaller, kind of at the feeder level, with at least some granularity finer than it is, because right now a critical load circuit could have one hospital and then 20,000 people on it, or something like that. In terms of could cover a wide swath of Austin. In fact, there were very large wide swaths of Austin that did not ever lose power, or lost it very briefly due to branch falling on a power line or something like that, but that they weren't turned off and they weren't rolled. I'm hopeful we'll see, at least at the utility level, action to kind of address those insufficiencies, but there wasn't any kind of movement at the state level on that yet.
And so there's another question in the Q&A. So there was a lot of sort of unconscionable blame of things like frozen wind turbines and renewables being responsible for such severe outages, which was just absolute falsehoods. But subsequently, after the political kind of winds settled down, has there been a renewed sort of emphasis or focus on renewables at the state level? Do either of you know anything about that?
So there's always a focus fighting them. Like there's always people out there who are like who are trying to fight against them. So it doesn't really matter, you know, what's going on. There's always a focus on that. There were some pushes to kind of tax renewables with additional cost on the grid. There was a couple bills that had language like that. None of them actually made it through. So the general market design and the way things kind of operate are stayed relatively unscathed, with the exception of there are these tax credits, these Chapter 313 and 312 tax credits, which are used by renewables, not just renewables, but also refineries and petrochemical plants. It's big infrastructure. It's local tax abatements and things like that that are used for these. That was allowed to elapse. So those tax provisions will go away in 2 years, unless something else is done, which in all likelihood, there probably will be something done about them. But at this point, if things stay the same, like they will, not only renewables, but also big petrochemical like facilities will lose the ability to have their tax credits. There was actually some legislation passed that will make it a little bit easier to build transmission in the state, which could incentivize more renewables out west if we're able to build up the backbone of power lines that we already have. So that could be that may be a silver lining out of some of this type stuff. But I'm not really aware of anything like at the distributed level or anything like residential solar or that kind of thing.
Yeah, our market design has helped renewables proliferate in a big way, which is great. There are talks about ways to kind of perhaps change the market to further incentivize more firm production or kind of known quantity of energy production for these sort of extreme events. There hasn't really been any talk about how you could also just incentivize and help customers participate in the market themselves, and recoup some of the value of voluntarily shedding load. Basically, the price of electricity was $9,000 a kilowatt hour, and if your power was cut off, you were essentially providing that power for free to the grid. And so, that hasn't been allowed, but I have hope, and I foresee that kind of becoming a further discussion point and coming around more and more as more and more of these distributed energy resources like solar, like batteries, get installed due to customers just wanting to have their own resilient systems and wanting to have their own, kind of control over their energy resources. That's a lot of like untapped potential and value in the market. So I think that it'll find a way to be harnessed.
That's great. So thank you. I want to thank, we're running up on time, and I want to give both of you a chance to kind of offer your final thoughts and recommendations for the architects who have joined us here today. But first, I want to thank you both for your time and for bringing your expertise to this conversation. I think it's really wonderful to have nuanced discussions about what happened. There's a lot of outrage, and reasonably so, but it's nice to have a level-headed conversation about what we can actually do if we can't rely on sort of systemic changes to our existing grid. What are the ways that architects are empowered to kind of design to solve those problems that are presented? So with that, I'll pose it to each of you. What are your final thoughts that you want to leave us with today?
Do you want me to go first? Do you want me to go first, Josh?
Go for it, Charlie.
So I'd say my final thought is there's so much to say about the resiliency topic. It's hard to capture in a 30-minute panel discussion. We didn't touch much on water, but that is an equally important component of a resilient building. A building that doesn't have energy or water to it is not useless, but it is not nearly as, it's not useful for like long-term habitation. You know, it's good for sort of emergency shelter, and that's it, essentially. So thinking through how to have ways to treat and or store water on site are important for kind of multi-day resiliency design aspects. And just big picture, the more efficient and resource wise and operationally efficient your building design is, the less it needs to stay in operation in the event of a disruption. So, you know, that's kind of the first and first line of defense in making a home or building more resilient.
Wow, great thoughts. Josh, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just piggyback on what Charlie said and kind of double down. It's just like when I think of resiliency, I think of, you know, what are the things that we're always trying to fight against, be it you know, heat or cold or water or sun or like gravity or, you know, whatever. What are those things we're always, you know, fighting against? And if it can be designed to make those fights small, then like the rest of the active systems which have interdependencies and do fail, you know, the impacts of those failures, you know, could be less.
Great. Well, again, thank you both so much for your time. For those of you in the audience who want to hear more on this topic, feel like you didn't quite get to let it air out like you wanted, the three of us actually, Josh, Charlie, and myself, and Christoph at Positive Energy did a podcast episode on this very subject pretty much right after the grid collapse. And it's the title of that episode is One Wheel Down and the Actual Dragging, just like this presentation. So I encourage you to go check it out. We're also on the web. If you thanks for putting up with a lot of Positive Energy perspective. We tend to have a boisterous worldview that we want to share with folks, and we appreciate you letting us do that today. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Kendall and Ashley to make any final announcements before we wrap up.
Thank you guys so much. We've been looking forward to having a conversation like this since February. So, and I think it's timely now. Hopefully we can continue the conversation. I put in the chat, this has been recorded and will be posted on our website soon. So you can pull it up and show it to your colleagues to get your own conversations going, and check out the podcast that Miguel mentioned. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Miguel. Oh, he froze.
Thanks, Kendall. Great job.
Thanks, Ash. I'll talk to you soon.
Do you have the stop recording option or?
Oh, stop recording.